Well, welcome everyone to tonight's church history class. Let's start with a prayer and then get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this evening. Lord, I thank you for each and every person who has been diligent and who has been faithful, Lord, who is able and willing to show up for these classes. I pray that you would bless each one, that you would use these classes to do your will in every life. Lord, we just thank you so much for the opportunity. I ask that you speak through me, Lord, that you separate the things that are not of you, and Lord, that you would just implant the knowledge that you would have each one of these students to have in their minds. And Lord, we do it all for you and for your glory and just to grow closer to you. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so tonight, quickly, this side of the board is going to be what we did not get to for the last exam. So I just want to touch on it because the Great Awakening is a significant event in our history. I actually have no idea if I'm going to test on this for the final. It will not be on your next test because the next test is just going to cover from this side of the board forward. So this kind of got left out. But I may put a couple of questions on the final from it. I don't know because I haven't gone through it yet. But anyway, so this information is sort of up in the ether somewhere in between tests and not really a place for it to fit. But I think it's important enough to mention so that you have an understanding of what the Great Awakening is. So it's a loose 10-year period. It is a movement that went across the colonies. Okay, so Englishmen primarily, but also other nationalities, but Englishmen came over, and by England I mean like the whole island. Like it could be England or Ireland or Scotland, or I mean it's the whole island that's right there. But that area, men had come over. So remember, there was still some persecution going on. There was still some resistance to Protestant thinking, and in the midst of that sort of settling down, lots of little, and they're not churches in the sense that what we would think of as church planting today. These were men who basically, whether they were in the colonies or whether they were in their home countries or whether they were doing missionary work outside of the States or England, they would basically just go anywhere and find a platform, request to be able to speak in that platform, or maybe an open area where they didn't need permission, and then they would just present the gospel. They would present testimony, and they would draw a crowd, and from those meetings you would have people coming to Christ. So it's not necessarily a building. Sometimes it was a house or a building or whatever. But sometimes it was simply a circuit, like where they would, like especially in the frontier, like of the colonies, there may not be anything anywhere. And so you just go over by that big rock over there and stand on it, and people would gather. And I mean, seriously. And some of these people, we're not going to talk about him tonight, but a man named James McGready, he was very well known in the colonies, and he was a circuit preacher, much like I don't know if you all have studied this or have heard about this before, but whenever Paul went on his missionary journeys, he would leave his hometown and then travel to different places. And in his case, he was actually planting churches, but again, not buildings. These are gatherings of people, right? So he would, his first missionary journey took him into Crete and then up into Galatia, and he's planted churches all across there, and then back down to Jerusalem. And basically that's what he was. He was a circuit preacher, and he would go through, stop in a town, give them the information he had, stay long enough to help the new believers feel stable, and then he'd move on to the next town. But then later he would come back through and he would retrace the circuit and visit, or he would send letters if he couldn't be there. Like in his absence, he would send letters, right? So he's sort of like this church father, so to speak. James McGready was very similar to that. Except that in the colonies, and that's what he would do. The people would hear, ooh, James McGrady is going to be over there by that rock, in 2 weeks. And so people would actually start gathering 2 or 3 days before he was scheduled, so to speak, to preach, and they would come and they would camp out and they'd wait for him. They'd sleep overnight for a couple of days, like concerts now, or Best Buy when the Apple Watch comes out or whatever. Like they come, they come early enough to get a good spot and they sleep there and they're just anticipating. But this was wanting to listen to somebody talk about Jesus. It was amazing. So, oh man, it would be amazing. So these guys were not quite these were not circuit people that necessarily went around, but these were definitely, many of them, not all, were definitely missionaries who started off in their home country and went to the colonies and stayed there with the intent to stay there, but in doing so ended up planting different, bringing their own philosophies with them and sharing it with the people that they meet, right? And remember, we talked about all of these denominations that were coming out of different dispersions, people trying to fix the Church of England and whatnot, right? And so as you read about these early colonists, if you can remember to pay attention to it, because it'll just briefly be mentioned and not even, it'll be a one sentence thing and that's it. But it'll tell you, ooh, this guy was a Scotsman, blah, 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 Presbyterian, blah, 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 blah. And just by reading that, you know that guy's influence is John Knox. And you can see how that area, he brought what he believed with him, and then he planted himself in the colonies, right? So these guys, they did that, and it ended up resulting in what we call the Great Awakening, where not just the natives, but the people who were coming, because not everybody came to the colonies to start preaching, right? Some people came to the colonies because they were being persecuted or because they didn't have money to live where they were, and there was this promise of a new life and a new beginning. Not necessarily wealth and prosperity, but just the promise of something better, right? So then these people that have something to say about Jesus would gather the people around them, and they would spread the gospel, so to speak, right? So I want you guys to know about 4 I'm going to call them key figures. They're certainly not, this is not by any stretch an exhaustive list, but these key men that are responsible for this movement called the Great Awakening, or this period of time. So this first guy, I do not know how to say his last name, so I'm going to say it the way that I say it, and I am sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I'm sure there's somebody German-ish that will see this at some point and be deeply offended. That's not my intention, but we're just going to go with it. So his name is Theodor Frelinghuysen. I practiced that. I know, I practiced it, so it sounds smooth, but I have no idea if that's correct. Anyway, this is a man who is from the Netherlands. He settled in what we now call New Jersey. This was a very strict, orthodox sort of preacher. He was very insistent on excommunications for certain behaviors. He was certainly a disciplinarian. If you're going to be representing and following Christ, there's a way to do it and a way to not do it, and he was just right on down that line. But he was definitely a Protestant. He was not that non-Protestants don't say born again, but that's a by and large a Protestant phrase, even though it's biblical. So he was definitely someone who, in his strictness, was saying, you have to have Jesus in the center of your life. And then from that, you discipline yourself and you do these things and don't do these things. So Frelinghuysen was a huge influence on that whole area. This man, William Tennant, I don't know if he was from Scotland or Ireland. Again, deeply offensive to anyone from that area to not know which area of England they're coming from, especially if you're getting Scotland and Ireland mixed up. That is very offensive to people. I'm not trying to be offensive. I simply don't know which area he came from. But that general island, right? He was a Presbyterian minister, so his influence was John Knox, right? And he started, one of the things that he's most well known for is he started a school called the Log College. And he started this so that his children, his sons in particular, would have some place to go and learn how to minister to people, how to be ministers, to learn the faith, to learn the discipline, to learn how to interact with people, right? So almost like a school of, a Bible school almost, right? This Log College, and it was eventually became, it started out being a training for his children, but because it was successful, it evolved into a training for actual ministers, people outside the family coming in and learning how to be a minister, so to speak. He focused on personal conversion and personal revival. I've heard Pastor Kahn say this many times, if you want to see revival, you draw a circle on the floor and you step in it and you start right there. You start with, you need to be revived, and then you can spread that to other people. That was kind of his way of thinking. This Log College was interesting because it became a template, or a template is not something that you would call a school, but the way that he set this up, many of the schools that are still in existence today are using his original outline for how he put this school together. And in this case, I don't remember if it's Princeton or, yes it is. So one of the colleges that was based and built and started around these principles of the Log College was Princeton. Princeton was not founded by him, it was founded by another man. But the man who founded it used Tennant's Log College principles to start and build that church. Interestingly enough, both Harvard and Princeton, Yale, those Ivy League colleges that have been around forever and ever, they began as schools of ministry. They began as...
They are no longer.
They are no longer, that's correct. And most people, myself included, before I took this class, a few years ago, I had no idea that those schools began with this at their root. So it's just interesting that, I should know that. But, I do now, and I don't know. But anyway, so... with this sort of Presbyterian-minded ideal, this school, there were two things. There was kind of a split in thinking. Okay, and I don't know. I can't give you examples of this school represents this side more, and this school that was created represents this side. I can't give you those kinds of facts, but in general, whenever the colleges were being put together, depending on who was trying to, like the board, so to speak, whoever's putting it together, they began to fall on two sides. There was the old side and the new side. That's creative, right? The old and the new? Anyway, whatever. So the old side cared less about this idea of revival. Not to say that they didn't care about revival at all. I'm not discounting revival. It was not emphasized. The emphasis was about tradition. Remember that a lot of these people, even though this is a Presbyterian-based ideal, not every minister that came into this or every person who was involved in the creation or the development of these schools were necessarily Presbyterian. Some of them came over as, there were lots of representatives from the Church of England and, just other areas, right? So, especially the Church of England people who are ingrained in tradition, because remember, the Church of England didn't want to stray from the Church at Rome too much. They just wanted government influence on it, right? Or the government wanted influence over it. The people didn't, they had no say in it. But, so they were the old side, so to speak, where they were much more concerned with tradition and less about this emphasis on revival. Whereas the new side, which is probably more of a Protestant-based, I'm just saying, that probably is, but I'm not sure. They really emphasized this personal revival and this personal development and cared much less about the traditions being maintained. And again, not to say tradition wasn't important or revival wasn't important. It's just where the emphasis lied and what they really pushed whenever they were trying to train up their ministers. Okay? So William Tennant had a huge impact. His impact, because of because of his law college, that is still affecting people today. I mean, those schools are still open and they're still producing people that are going to run our country, right? In some, so to speak. So anyway, so that was William Tennant. Third, I wanted to talk about Jonathan Edwards. He was actually born in the colonies. He was born in Connecticut. Yes, so homegrown, a homegrown Great Awakening guy. So he was a Puritan by denomination. He actually is one of the people who started a college. He started Princeton. He's a founder. The thing that Jonathan Edwards is most known for, and it's interesting because my understanding is, I have not taken a poll, so all of this is my understanding is, but my understanding is that especially actually in the secular world, he is most known for this, even more so than in the Christian world. It's just one of those things. It's sort of like Calvin being known in the secular world because of his interactions with Servetus. Like, the secular world really knows that because, I mean, it was a very negative impact on society and, in general. Kind of in the same way this was. It depends on, again, it depends on the lens that you look through whenever you hear about what he is well known for. So in 1741, so first of all, Jonathan Edwards, super monotone, super laid back. I am way excited compared to him. He's just really, he's just very calm, very monotone, very, la, 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 la. So, drink your coffee and then go to the service, because if you are not interested, you may kind of lose things because of his monotone. Not because he was a bad teacher or a bad preacher. It was just, it's hard to stay monotone and keep people, keep people with you, right? So in 1741, he gave this sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You can look it up and read it. And basically what he did was, he was talking about how people need to repent of their sin. They need to recognize, they need to take responsibility for, and then once they do those things, they need to repent of their sin and do it in short order, because the very gates of hell are screaming to be opened up and swallow you down for your lack of pietisness, right? So the people who were sitting in the pews, now you can imagine, like, it's one thing, you can just kind of put yourself in these shoes. Most of us have been to different kinds of church services with different ways of presenting it. And you can go to really like fired up and just like, wow, and you get really excited and you just can't help it. And then you can go to other services where, it's pretty calm, but then people every now and then get a little bit excited and everybody wakes up and then you're back down again, right? But then is you can go to something like what I imagine he was giving, where he's simply standing up here. I've been to one. Yeah, and he's just talking, not getting upset, not raising his voice, not saying anything, monotone, blah, blah, blah. You're all going to hell unless you repent, blah, 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 right? So, so how many of you guys have a person in your life where you have a person in your life where they're really excitable? I can't imagine who that would be for me. Anyway, so you're a really excitable person, and so they get upset easily. Not that they get violent or yelling or whatever, but they just get excited easily. They're engaging, and they're like, what's going on? They freak out, right? So how many people know that person and then have been around that person when something real happens? And that person no longer behaves the way that you expect them to. They suddenly take Jonathan Edwards' personality and they're like, okay, all right, well, we'll deal with that. And suddenly you're more scared of what is happening with this person. You forgot why we're upset. And you're just like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you freaking out, right? So whenever somebody is delivering something to you that is very difficult to hear. I mean, that is a hard message. You're all going to hell unless you repent, right? And I mean, it's a true statement, but, these things, let's talk in love. Let's be humble. Let's be, and not that he wasn't those things. It's just that when it's delivered as matter-of-factly as, yeah, and I'm going to stop at the store and get a bag of apples on the way home, and, everyone's going to hell unless you repent. And you're just like, what? I mean, you can imagine the people in this audience, it's not a performance, but the people in this service, I mean, they're probably looking at each other like, why isn't he freaking out? Like, this is did you hear what he said? Like, can you imagine, like, sitting there and just being like, oh, that's what the people did. They totally reacted to it. And he didn't even get through his whole sermon. People began to get out of the, I don't know if they were, I guess, pews. They began to get out of their chairs, whatever they were sitting in, crawling along the floor, gripping the pews as they went, like this, and saying, okay, we get it. Just stop. Tell us what we do before the ground opens up and we fall into hell. Yeah, I mean, they were freaking out. And, he's like, he didn't really say, this is me. I haven't finished my teaching yet, But seriously, like, he didn't even get to finish his teaching before people were like, and they were freaking out. Huge revival came out of this monotone, scary, what's going on teaching. Now, getting back to the lens. Depending on your lens, if you're a Christian and you look at that, you're like, oh, glory to God. He totally used this guy who, if I had my vote, wouldn't even keep anybody's attention because he has no, life or whatever, right? I don't know, whatever. God can use anybody, right? That's the Christian view, and praise God for this sermon, and we still have it, and we can still read it, and we can learn from it. The secular view is more like, whoa, dude is whack, right? I mean, and what was up with these people? Like, did they give them something on the way in? Like, why did everybody freak out? It's just a talk. It's just a speech, So he's very well known for this sermon because the secular world is like, okay, like they're, okay, well, if that's how you guys want to, it's just another way for them to sort them and us, sort of way for unbelievers to look at believers and be like, wow, I do not understand you people at all. Like, this is so crazy. You guys totally freaked out, right? But again, his main message was you have to hear it, accept it, and then once you accept it, you repent from it. So if you're in the position of not hearing or accepting, then you look at this and you're like, well, okay, bunch of crazies. So anyway, he's very well known for this sermon. And I encourage you, it's not very long. If you have, half an hour or whatever, you could even just skim through it. It's interesting. So anyway, so that's Jonathan Edwards. All right, George Whitefield. We've already talked about George Whitefield. One thing that I did not tell you is that he's known as the father of mass evangelism. And just so you know, I'm pretty sure that on the final, I have a section of fathers of. So I'm pretty sure. So like a matching, like George Whitefield would be the father of modern mass evangelism. I probably would know that because that's just my style. I'm pretty sure if it's in there, I'm keeping it. So just know that that's who he is. George Whitefield, just as a super short talk about him, remember he and John Wesley sort of got together. Wesley was the founder or the person who put together the Methodist doctrine, and Whitefield was this great orator. So he was basically circuit preaching, not just in England, but all over the place. Ended up in America just like he ended up in the colonies, just like he ended up in all these other places. And Whitefield was sort of keeping him on track. And then remember, there's two sets. He was, Wesley was highly Calvinistic. He was an Arminianist, and we end up having these two sort of branches within the Methodist Church. So we've already talked about Whitefield, so we don't really have to go through him again. But because he was basically, if you want to call him an international circuit preacher, he did end up, and we talked about him going to Georgia, going to the colonies. So he did have an effect and was part of the success of the Great Awakening in the colonies. So those four guys I just want you to have an idea about. All right, so does everybody have this information? Okay, so I'm going to fill in some blanks about. So now we're starting the lecture that was supposed to start tonight. So this is old information. Now we're going to start with the new unit's worth of information. All right. Okay, so this is again a little bit of a review, just so our thinking is together, right? So starting with the Reformation, we're going to compare and contrast the last 4 ages or periods of time with the question, what is man seen as a definition of the era? Okay, a generalized definition of the era. So in the Reformation, man was seen as a sinner who was saved by grace. Shortly following, or as part of it, kind of overlapped with the Reformation, the Renaissance came along, and man was seen as, well, not really so bad. We're actually pretty good. Like, we're good people and have good intentions. So we're really not, I mean, this is a little harsh. Sinners, saved by grace, we're not that bad. Man is we're good. Then as that evolved into the age of reason, which is what we talked about with at the end of the last unit, reason became the center of everything. And so man can think his way through whatever needs to happen. So it's not man going to God or going to the Word of God or praying or seeking godly counsel to figure out what to do. It's now man can think his own way into understanding and move forward. Because of that, the need for God is diminished, and this age of secularism, this period of secularism is born and begins to progress. So after the age of reason, we move into the age of progress, where man is seen as getting better and better and better and better. The potential is just outrageous. And this idea of the need for God lessens, and therefore secularism, I mean, it's sort of a linear relationship. As the need for God goes down, secularism is going to naturally come from that, right? So this age of progress, it's a pretty long era. It's going to encompass a lot of different movements within it. You don't need to necessarily know these dates. It's just so you have some understanding or bearing. One of the first things that came out of this age is the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution had a huge, huge, huge impact on the church, major impact on the church. It was negative, but it was still a huge impact. So it's good to understand how the French Revolution, because when you read about the French Revolution in history books, there is a component of religious sort of light that's shed on things, but really it's much more, or at least what I've read, it's much more government oriented. It's really about King Louis XVI and his wife, and all the monarchy and blah blah blah, and the politics and the finances and the war and the wars that were happening. They were coming out of wars and potentially heading into wars and whatever. So when you read about the French Revolution, it really focuses around the politics. But what we're going to focus on, while the politics play a role too, we'll talk a little bit about it. We're going to talk about how it influenced Christianity at that point, and then how it's still impacting us now. So, in general, the French Revolution stressed the glorification of man and not God. So it really is just a continuation of what started in the Age of Reason. They overlap. It's just that it becomes much more intense. As time goes on, God is less important, man is more important. And as time goes on, man believes they're more important because, we're very smart. We figured out all this stuff. We can speak well, we can teach, we have lots of children, we're very successful. And so it all becomes about us. It all centers around man, and there's no room for two idols. You can't have man and then also try to worship the living God. So it just naturally starts to fade. This is very important because I promise you this will be on tests. So the 3 key words of the French Revolution are liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay? And just as a way of separating them for you, Liberty is defined as individual freedoms in politics and economics. And one of the things that I want you to remember, so remember coming out of a feudalist society or a monarchy where, well, we're going to talk about this more in a second, but remember that the people who were living at this time, they didn't live like us, where we just go and we're going to buy a house. Oh, well, we're going to sell that house and we're going to buy it over here. Oh, we're going to keep this house and rent it, and then we're going to buy a new one over here, and we're going to get a second car, and we're going to have a timeshare. You know, that is not how society worked then. It was really a very strict line. You were either wealthy or you were very poor. Okay, so when you're talking about individual freedom in politics and economics, that is a huge statement. It's not huge for the wealthy, but it was a huge statement for the people who were not considered wealthy. Okay, let's see, equality. This is equal rights, regardless of background, ethnicity, or financial position. And again, remember, P-O-S-I-T-I-O-N. Okay, so remember whenever we say this, like me, when I read that, the one thing that I personally key into is ethnicity. Because in my world, where I live right now, there is a lot of turmoil and trauma around. So for me, living in this time right now, that would be what I'm like, oh, yes, that's what I would focus on, right? But remember, at this time, it's not that ethnic barriers were not there, but when you're talking about financial position and equality between the wealthy and the not wealthy, huge. If you were living in France at this time, the ethnicity part of it may not even cross your mind. I mean, it's there and it's sort of under the thing. Just like whenever I hear it, this is big for me, and I'm like, oh yeah, well, financial position, you know. But it was very likely opposite. Like they're like, well, you know, okay, ethnicity, yeah, that's an issue in regions. But man, you're telling me that the wealthy and the not wealthy have equal rights? Huge, huge, huge concept, okay? So when you're going through this stuff, try to, as much as you can, see it through the lens of the people who were living it instead of your own personal lens. It's hard to do that, but it'll help you understand the impact. And then fraternity is basically brotherhood and the idea that we're in this together. So this is an extension almost of nationalism, which we've talked about quite a bit. It's still this idea of people living together, working together, bonding together, supporting each other, and uniting in that support of one another. Now, at this time, okay, so the French Revolution began in 1789. I told you that to tell you this. Just prior to that, in 1785, and again, these dates, I'm not going to test you on the dates, I just want you, I just want in your mind to be straight, okay? So in 1785, this was the layout or the makeup of the country, okay? You have major class differences, okay? You were either a landowner or you were middle class okay, now those terms in this day and age don't really mean too much because almost everybody in America is a landowner, so it doesn't mean much to us. And middle class is where people want to be. I mean, well, okay, people want to be upper class, but people are, are striving for the middle class. We just want to make it. Just want to have food. Just want to keep our job, right? But in this time, the landowners were all nobility, okay, as well as the clergy. Okay? Because remember, gifts of land going to the church, blah, 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 right? So the landowners were the nobility and the clergy, and basically, the middle class was everyone else. Basically, okay? Now, middle class at this time in France was not what middle class is here, where you have food every night and, you got a job to go to the next day, blah, blah, right? These were people who were, it was actually by our standards, exceptionally low class. These were people who were working themselves to death if they could get a job, and they were barely able to survive. They were barely able to provide for their families. It was very, very financially desolate for this class of people, okay? Now, what's even more interesting is that this was 1/2 of 1% of the population. The nobility and the clergy made up 1/2 of 1% of the entire population. So that means that 99.5% of the people fell into the middle class. That was the division. Yeah. So now, knowing what you know here, equality with financial position, equality with background, nobility versus the commoner, basically, huge, right? So, and you can see where fraternity would come out of this era, because that's where these people were. We have nobody to help us. That's how they felt. And we are in this together, right? Okay, so there was lots of taxing. So the politics around this time are intense. King Louis the 16th was in power with his wife Marie Antoinette. Everyone has heard about, or at least most people have heard about Marie's "let them eat cake" phrase. If you actually research that, very few of the sources that I read actually state that she said that. Most say that she probably didn't. It's interesting. Well, we're going to find out this whole idea and this class of people that end up causing or pushing the French Revolution, it's a mob mentality. So many things that come out, I'm not saying it's not true. She may have said it. I have no idea. I personally wasn't there, so I don't know. But I'm just saying, I was not there. Can you believe that? But it's it is just as possible. I guess what I'm telling you is it's just as possible that she said it as it is that these people were so irritated with her wealth that they said she said it. Or she said something like, well, maybe she was actually making a statement like, well, people are here for this party, so let them have some cake. Give them something to eat. And then somebody heard that and said, in her wealth and in her arrogance, she's just flaunting it, saying, let them eat cake, and then she doesn't give it to, whatever. Who knows? Who knows what happened? But that phrase is definitely under question. So just so you know, that was totally a side note. It has nothing to do with church history. Anyway, so, sorry. I know. So it's interesting if you read about her, King Louis and Marie Antoinette, it is so interesting, but it'll completely distract you for probably longer than you probably don't have that much time. But anyway, so there was lots of politics, lots of coming out of wars, going into wars, threats of wars, blah, blah, blah. King Louis XVI was not managing things well economically. He was, in retrospect, I've read a couple of sources that have claimed that he was probably clinically depressed and was therefore acting like somebody who is depressed, because he would do things like be confronted with, you need to make this decision, or you need to meet with people to talk about this change or whatever, and he would just kind of retreat. I mean, he'd just disappear, and no one even knew where he was. So for small periods of time. But anyway, he just was not always a super effective leader, okay? Now, the people were being taxed, and there was a process that the government went through to discuss or to determine, are we going to lay this tax on the people? Are we going to pay this tax to another government, decisions like that. Is money going to come in? Are we going to send money out? Those kinds of decisions. Interestingly, their voting system there were 3 members of their, I don't really want to call it parliament because that's the wrong word, that has a different connotation today, but 3 members of their decision-making group, okay? You had the nobility that had a vote, you had the clergy that had a vote, and then you had the people that had a vote. Okay? So, as you might guess, you'll note that nobility and clergy are in the same class, and then the people are in a different class, right? So, vote comes up that says, should we tax because the people began to say, you have most of the money. You should be taxed as much as we're taxed. Like, you should be paying taxes just as much as we're paying taxes on what you have, right? Because he was taxing the people pretty heavily, and they didn't even have bread to eat, right? So that was one of the complaints that was coming up. So then they say, okay, we'll take it to the board. Should nobility be taxed? Well, nobility says no. Clergy says, oh my gosh, if they start taxing the nobility, they're going to come after us too. No. People, yep. Sorry, 2-1. We're not going to tax nobility. Then they would say, oh, we might go to war with Austria. So we're getting threats. Maybe we should tax the people so that we can gather money to train soldiers or to build garrisons or train or, whatever. Pick a topic, right? And the nobility says, oh my gosh, we totally need to protect everything. The clergy says, yeah, I'm not interested in being overtaken. And the people are like, we don't have any money. Stop taxing us. Oh, sorry, 25% tax on everything you have. Right? So this is the way that it worked. In general, these 2 classes were right. Well, yeah, and they what this one wanted, this one wanted. Do you know what I mean? They're working to get yes. It was mutually beneficial for these guys to work together, and these guys were kind of out in the cold, like, whatever. And so it was just not a very fair system all the way around. It was very unfairly cut. Like the population, and then really not very fairly governed. And then on top of all that, you've got a king who is not necessarily as responsible or as effective as he could be. So it's sort of a boiling pot. We're heading into some serious trouble, right? Well, so without going into a lot of detail, that's sort of the political, at this time, that's sort of the political environment, right? All right, so they still had meetings, not always to make decisions, but they would come together, and the nobility and the clergy, who would obviously make most of the decisions, they would hear from the people, or the people would ask to be heard by them, right? So in one of these meetings, this man right here, Maximilien Robespierre, he was a representative of the people, okay? He declared to the nobility and to the clergy that they absolutely needed to be taxed. And it was not, they're not going to be able to get the money out of the people that they need to sufficiently turn the financial situation of the government around. They're going to have to play their part, basically, is what he was saying. You've got to give some of your own wealth if you want this to work. Well, Louis XVI actually thought that was insane. Like, why would he ever do that? And he didn't listen to them at all. Well, the people had just about as much as they could stand from the way that the government was behaving. So, over the next, from 85 to 89, over the next 4 years, with all of these talks, I mean, these are not one-time events where something just happened. All these meetings and these votes and these taxes and the this and that, all this stuff is just happening over the 4 years. Well, in 1789, a large representative of the people, thousands of people in this category, the middle class, thousands of middle class people came together and they said, all right, we have had all we're going to take of the French government. We've had enough of Louis XVI. We've had enough of the wealth. We've had enough of the nobility. We're done, right? And so what ends up coming out of this, I really want you to understand the difference between these two words so that whenever you read anything, you can understand the difference, because many times I've been guilty of this. They're used interchangeably. They're not interchangeable. Okay? So you can have a revolt or you can have a revolution. Okay? Both of them have to do with changing. Okay? They're usually violent, but they don't have to be. A revolt is basically, it's usually violent, a violent way to go against the government. Okay, now what does that mean? Go against the government. It could be going against a law. It could be going against the physical people who are running the government, but it's pushing back against something in the government. A revolution is usually violent, not always, but is usually violent. It's a violent way to actually end the rule of the current government and institute a new rule. Okay? So this is basically, we want you to change your mind, and we're going to force you to in whatever way we can. And this is, we're not even going to discuss it with you. You're gone, and your way of living is gone, and we're going to establish something that's going to benefit us. Okay? So when we're talking about the French Revolution, we're talking about the shutting down of a government and the starting of something new. So it's very radical. Okay? All right. So these people, they break into an armory, and they take, so now we're back to the thousands of people mobbing, right, coming in. This is now in 1789. See if I can have it. They steal 28,000 muskets from the government. They break into an armory and they steal muskets from the armory. But the French government's not stupid. They only store the muskets there. They don't store the gunpowder or the means to use them in that facility, right? So they have all these muskets, and really all they are big sticks, right? No. Right. So I mean, granted, they're really painful sticks if you hit them, hit somebody with them, but they're not going to serve their real purpose. However, they also know that the gunpowder that they're after is in the Bastille. Okay? The Bastille is one of the primary, whenever you read about the French Revolution, it centers around the Bastille. So these people now, semi-armed, they have the weapon but not the way to use it. They move from the armory and they head over to the Bastille, and they're going to take what they want from the Bastille. Now this is it has a multi-purpose. It does have the powder and the blah blah so that the guns will actually fire, but it's also a storage or a facility that houses prisoners. So depending on what viewpoint you read in history about the French Revolution, some of the writings will emphasize that the crowds were coming to get the prisoners out of the Bastille that were being held without reason. Okay, so like political prisoners or blah, blah. There's lots of writings where that's the focus. Then other writings focus on, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. If you have a secular lens on it, it's all about political prisoners. If you have a church history lens on it, it's all about changing the way that the government is suppressing and alienating the people, and we're just going to change it, and we're not going to have this religion that they've been forcing on us anymore. You see what I'm saying? So, anyway, the Bastille at this time, on this day, had about 110 soldiers in it. Plus, this governor was at the Bastille, Governor Dunaway. Okay? So, you can imagine. I don't know how news travels without having a smartphone or the internet, but I don't know if the people at the Bastille had heard about the armory. I don't know how much time. I'm sure it's out there. I just don't know what the answer is. I don't know if these guys knew what was happening or if they didn't know. But it doesn't really matter. If you're standing inside of a fortress, or, fortress, so to speak, inside the city, and you see thousands of people coming down the streets and heading straight for you, if you know about the armory, you're like, uh-oh, we've got the gunpowder. If you don't know about the armory, you're wondering if they're going to keep going, or, you guys need to start turning, you're going to hit us. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know what these guys were thinking inside the Bastille, but I can tell you, when those thousands of people showed up at that gate and stopped and were, I would imagine, screaming, rocking, throwing, I mean, there's no telling what they were doing. These 110 men, it is pants wetting time. You got to know it, right? This is not a good thing. So, Dunaway, as the primary, the head honcho, for those of you that used to watch Happy Days, the grand poobah of the Bastille, he was sent out to represent those soldiers, and his job was to minimize loss of life. Like, obviously, 110 against thousands, I mean, what are you going to do, right? And it's a fortress. I'm not sure that, I suppose I saw one of you going like this, run. There could be people that got out through the back. I don't know. It kind of depends. If you've got a prison system, I'm not sure how easy it is to get out the back. I don't know. I don't have any idea. So, but just, put yourself in these shoes and just like, wow, like this is not a place you want to be. So anyway, whatever. I am just really ranting off at the mouth. I got to keep going. All right. So the Bastille, with the government, the political prisoners, the housing of at least part of the weaponry, all of these things, what it represented at this time was everything that the people were having issues with. You know what I'm saying? Like, this was a center point of disdain. Right? So they show up and, yelling and screaming and whatever the heck is happening. And this guy, Governor Dunaway, comes out and he says, all right. Oh, and, okay, trivia. That could be a bonus question.
Oh, great.
I don't know. I haven't written it. I may forget by the time I write the test, but it'd be a fun bonus question. There were several eyewitnesses that took notes and talked about this storming of the Bastille on the day this happened. One of the people that wrote about it, Thomas Jefferson. He was standing there. I know, cool, fun fact, right? Thomas Jefferson was standing on the street and saw it happen and wrote an eyewitness account about it. So anyway, we're not going to talk about that either, but just fun fact. Anyhow, so the governor comes out and says, okay, look, we will let you into the Bastille. You don't have to break the gates down and kill everybody. We will allow you into the Bastille, and you can, take what you want. Our condition is that you don't kill anybody. Like, don't kill the guards, don't kill me. We'll just let you in, and you guys, freak out and do what you're going to do. The mob agreed, and air quote, agreed. But as soon as they rushed in, they killed him and all the, nobody got out as far as I know. Except for the prisoners. The prisoners didn't get killed. But if you are reading a text that is more focused on political prisoner, like they were storming it to get into the political prisoners, there were only 7. Oh, so, whatever. But I'm just telling you, there's lots of different lenses to look through, but whatever. So they storm the Bastille. They take the gunpowder that they want. They basically kill off the people that they find that are not political prisoners. Of course, they let the prisoners go. And this is the official beginning of the French Revolution. Was sort of the prequel was the Armory, and the storming of the Bastille is we're now full on going against the government. We're going to take them down. Okay. All right. By January, so this is 1789. So by I think January of 1793, King Louis is executed. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette executed. By 1794, Maximilien Robespierre executed. Now he's a representative of the people. Executed. Governor Delaunay, he never made it that far. He was killed at the Bastille, right? So one of the things that I want you to understand about what I'm doing here, as I mentioned, this was mob mentality. This was a huge group of people under an exceptionally emotional stress and strain who had been for years oppressed and felt as though they had been very much mistreated by their government. They had asked nicely, so to speak, for years to have some bit of liberty, equality, and fraternity to come out of the government with no response except either a complete turning and ignoring or a vote against, right? And this mob mentality, it's not surprising that they took out the government officials, but the mob mentality, there are no boundaries. Mob mentality is scary, no matter what you're talking about, because there is no control. There's no, for lack of a better word, there's no reason behind it. Whatever the majority of the emotion is behind, that's what's going to win. And this dude did something and he's gone. Maybe he said, look, if we're going to I'm totally making this up. Maybe this guy just said, look, we need to settle down and establish a new government. We don't have a government anymore. So we need to settle down and do something. And maybe they said, no, we don't. Kabang! Who knows? Who knows? I don't know what happened to him, but mob mentality, it's easy to get sucked into when you agree with it, but man, you better watch out because it's going to sneak around and it's going to bite you because it changes on a whim. Okay? So that's what was happening. Now, when Louis XVI was executed, guess what? The clergy, I erased it. The clergy, so the nobility part of it is gone. The clergy, they're not stupid. They're like, I am out of here. Like if they have the guts and the power to kill the nobility, kill the king, I will never make it. So the nobility, they booked it out. So now there's really no influence. That 3-part government, it's now one. There is no more nobility, and the clergy took off because they're not interested in being executed. Right? So now put yourself in, so this is happening in France, right? Now put yourself in Germany and Austria and Switzerland and Italy and England and Ireland and Scotland and all the areas that are kind of surrounding France. Can you imagine? Again, they didn't have a smartphone, so I don't know how long it took them to find out what was happening over there. But seriously, can you imagine as the leader or whatever category you want to be in, you find out that the people revolted against the country, or not revolted, sorry, revolutionized against the government and killed everybody off and ran the people who could have taken over out of town. What? Like, it was crazy. The rest of the world who, was finding out about it, they were like, whoa, those guys are cray-cray. Like, they're freaking out, right? Like, so it was just really scary for everybody. All right, so as part of this mob mentality, so they got rid of the government. The government was, just like it always had been, it was enforcing some forced religion, whether that's, Church of England or, whatever, or it could be a Protestant, whatever. So what the revolutionists did is they said, no religion. Religion's out. No Christianity, no nothing. It's all out. We are now a 100% secular country. They declared this is no longer a Christian nation. What they ended up doing was I think it was Notre Dame. Did I write it down? Yes. They being, and this is just like mob mentality. I don't know who they are. It's just, the people went into Notre Dame and they tore down the altar, and an altar to liberty was installed inside of Notre Dame. So there was an altar for religious purposes in there. AR? Is it AR? They tore that down and they replaced it with what they called an altar of liberty. They gutted it, and they kind of built this sort of mountain on the inside, like, something that you can get up on top of. And they started calling it the Temple of Reason. And when you went into the Temple of Reason, on top of that little mountain that they built on the inside of the building, they had the goddess of reason. Depending on the text that you read, some will say, oh, they were not worshiping the goddess, the person. They were worshiping reason. Other texts, that's a secular viewpoint for the most part. I mean, that's a loose statement, A religious viewpoint, regardless of what religion you want to call it, they look at that and say, well, of course they were worshiping the person and not the reason. But it makes more sense if you think about the way that here I am using reason. Anyway, if you think about the way that this whole thing happened, it makes sense that it wouldn't matter who was on top of the mountain. What they were really interested in was reason. Okay? But I don't know. I wasn't there. So, again, wasn't there. Anyway, so what came out of all of this is what is known as the cult, meaning that a very wrong view of Jesus is in the center of it, of reason. So, whereas the age of reason sort of bred this lack of need for God and this birth of secularism, it's sort of like a baby was born kind of thing and is sort of learning how to walk. By the time all of this happened, you had a full-on religion of no religion called the cult of reason. And what was being worshipped was not a god, but an ideal. Okay? All right. And just so you know, I mean, just to put things together, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France. Talk amongst yourselves. Anyway, so I'll let you take that and do what you want with it. So was that to us at that time? Yeah, close, real close. Yeah, and if you read inscriptions, you'll note that there's liberty, equality, fraternity. I'm just saying. All right, but you guys can do that yourself and research that. That's about as far as my 10-foot pole's going there. All right. So, all right. Now this is the new religion. In 1841, now we're skipping ahead a little bit, Napoleon Bonaparte comes in. Now we're not going to talk about his politics, but one of the things that he did do whenever he had his power is he reinstated Catholicism into this nation. But along with reinstating it, he also tolerated Protestantism. So it didn't, this being the only thing way of thinking. It didn't last very long, but it did last for a little while. So and it's not to say just because he reinstituted Catholicism doesn't mean that this went away. It just means that religion was back in the nation, okay? Or a Christian religion was back in the nation. All right, now the Catholic Church, it's interesting. The Catholic Church is not stupid. They have been around for a long time. They watch and they learn, and just like any other group of people, they react to just like anybody, even an individual, how they are treated, they react to, right? We saw that with the Council of Trent. We saw that with even the Council of Nicaea. How you're treated, you react to it, and something comes from that, right? So the Catholic Church, the lessons that they learned from the French Revolution was, and this is very loosely, this is a generalized statement, but generally speaking, because remember, they were kicked out, the Catholic Church, and the Protestant Church too, but they were kicked out. And so now they're looking, so then they're let back in and they're like, all right, what have we learned from the French Revolution as far as our position in this nation, or in this area, whatever. They're saying, okay, if we give the people too much freedom, they kill the people who are in charge, or they run them out of town. And whenever the religion is allowed back in the nation, it's not the same as it used to be. If there is a religion that is absolutely deep-seated into tradition, it is the Catholic Church. It is very important. Tradition is so important. So whenever you bring back something under the title of Catholicism and you alter it, it's like adultery. It's like blasphemy. You don't change the traditions of the church, right? And Napoleon, he was not a priest. Dude's not a priest, right? He's just interested in having Catholicism back in the nation. Just like King Henry VIII, not a priest. He just wants to keep the religion, and he just wants to have a little bit of hold over it, right? So the Catholic Church is like, look, you give the people too much freedom, they completely run amok with it, and they destroy the religion. Then when it comes back in, it's not what it used to be. It's kind of a altered state of what it should have been. And so the Catholic Church is in general wanting to keep control over the people, not in a bad way. I'm not saying this like controlling, mean, you're not allowed, blah, 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 but this idea that we, the church, the Catholic Church, we are in control and we are going to be your authority was very much heightened by the French Revolution. Because they were basically like, look, see what happens when we're not in charge? You guys are crazy. Like, that's why we're going to be in charge. So the French Revolution had a very solidifying effect, generally speaking, on how the Catholic Church views its authority over the people. And that's important to understand. Okay, so we have 10 minutes, and I am so talking too much. All right. So some things came out of it and I'm just going to talk about this. Once the church got back in, 1846, so 5 years later, whatever, Pope Pius IX is in power, or is the Pope at the time. He's very sweet, very well-meaning. He's a wonderful person, very kind. He gave the Papal States a constitution that allowed the people a very small measure of being able to participate in the government. Because, even in 5 years' time, the reins were down, and it's only the church that's going to make decisions. This guy comes in and he says, well, in the Papal States, we'll have a constitution. We'll start maybe just teeny, little itty-bitty bits of bringing the people and their influence back into the church, kind of thing, sort of starts. Well, his prime minister, his name was Count Pellegrino Rossi. He was a mediator between Pius IX and the Papal States, like the churches and the people, where he's just an intermediary. Well, revolutionaries, because again, this is still a revolution, there's still pockets of crazy going on, right? Well, anyway, this guy Rossi, Count Rossi, he was assassinated by revolutionaries. And the French military currently, at this time, is helping to guard the Vatican, is guarding Rome, and just they are being employed, these French soldiers. Well, after Count Rossi is assassinated by these revolutionaries, Pius, that's all it took, because he was trying. Like, that was his way in his heart, like his kindness. He was trying to extend some bit of liberty back to the people, and they killed his representative, and he totally turned, and he was like, forget that, you guys, I'm not playing anymore. The little bit of freedom I gave you, it's exactly what, in general, the church has said, can't give them any freedom or they'll turn on you. And so about the same time that all this was happening, there's a man named Victor Emmanuel II who was made the King of Italy. Now, not the Papal States, but the King of Italy. And he starts pressing in on the Vatican, on Rome, on Vatican City. He starts pressing in to begin to take control of it. Okay? Of course, the Vatican doesn't want anybody taking control of Rome. They want control of Rome, right? It's their city. Well, war breaks out. It's the Franco-German War, if that means anything to anybody. The Franco-German War breaks out. All those soldiers that are currently in Rome that are being employed to guard the city and guard the Vatican, they're gone. They're back to France because they have a war to fight. Well, now, this new king of Italy, this is in like 1860 or 1861, so just a few years later, he comes into Rome and he takes over easily because there's nobody guarding it anymore. They've all taken off to go fight their own war. Well, the Pope, so this Pius IX, he retreats back into the Vatican and becomes closed off within the walls of the Vatican, doesn't come out into the city anymore. And he tells the people, you are to have no interaction with this government that has come in and taken over. You are to remain, if you're going to remain true to the church, you're going to stay out of the government. Like, you just don't even have anything to do with it. And these people were like, yes, sir, you got it. We're not going to interact with the government. And it became almost an entity within an entity, a city within a city that was not necessarily under any rule of Rome, like under this new king, but they had no influence over each other. The Vatican had no influence over the king had no influence over the Vatican. So it's almost like living inside of a bubble inside of a walled city. Do you know what I'm saying? So it was just a very interesting time. Now, Pius reacted to that, and he called a council. This is so important in the last 6 minutes. This is important because this council, again, has had a long-lasting effect. All of these ecumenical councils have had lasting effects. So it's called Vatican I. And it was called by Pope Pius the Ninth. And this is basically, for all intents and purposes, a response to this new leader coming in and this new king of Italy coming into the city. Okay? And this is on the tail end of the French Revolution and all the stuff that had been going on there, right? So just a lot of like crazy, right? A lot of craziness going on. So a lot of people term, or sources, whatever, they'll term Vatican I as the quote-unquote knee-jerk response to the invasion of what you can call an invasion of Rome. I mean, he was the king of Italy. He wasn't invading his own city. So it's not an invasion. It was simply taking over an unwanted government that came in and was trying to influence the church. So two important things came out of Vatican I that have long-lasting effects. More things came out of it. I'm just going to talk about two. One of them was the supreme authority was given to the Pope. So this council, they take votes and they make decisions about the church, right? That's what these councils do. They make major doctrinal decisions about the church. So one of those decisions is, from this point forward, the Pope has absolute supreme authority over, you name it, everything. And one of the responses to that is number 2, the ideal of papal infallibility was established. So what that means is, so there is what's called the chair. It's a literal chair, that when the Pope sits in this seat, he is hearing directly from and learning directly from God himself. So what that means is, while he's sitting in the chair, anything that he says coming from sitting in the chair, because it comes directly from God himself, is supreme. So it doesn't matter what it overrides. And I'm not saying that it overrides anything. I'm just telling you, if the Pope is sitting in the chair, and this is the most ridiculous example, and he says that clergy have to have black hair. That's it. That's it. There's no question. There's no discussion. There's nothing. That is it, because it was a direct word from God himself to the Pope. Okay? Very, very important. So, whenever the Pope sits in the chair, he's meditating, God is thinking in him. This is a Jesuit viewpoint. The Jesuits came up with this sort of idea that ended up being called papal infallibility. There was a period of time, I have not read this, but I got this from my church history class. I haven't found it, so, do with it what you will. But I was told that hymns were sung to the Pope and not to God after this was put into place for about 15 years. It changed, but just about the first 15 years. And again, it would make sense if this really is the quote-unquote knee-jerk response where the Catholic Church is saying, you guys are crazy, we gave you a little freedom, you're killing our people, you're going to do what we say. The man became so important at this time. And then I think, if that's true, the church realized it in short order and was like, probably ought to direct those back to God. And it changed, assuming that it happened in the first place. Okay? So, we don't need to talk about that. One of the things is that the Pope was referred to as, because of this papal infallibility, the vice God of humanity. So basically the representative. I mean, that's all it's saying, is that the Pope has the supreme authority, and anything that comes from the chair cannot be questioned, cannot be changed, and will not be disputed at all. You won't do it. So those are two of the things that came out of Vatican I. All right. So the last thing, I'm not going to have a chance to get into all of that, but I do want to talk about one other thing, because this is going to be hit in your reading. So I just want to touch on it real quick. So all of this is response, again, to the French Revolution. On some level, the French Revolution is responsible for some of the fear and the authority and the we're not going to put up with this attitude that came from the church. Is it fair? I don't know. I mean, how would I feel coming off of that? Probably exactly the way they felt. I mean, it was a really, really crazy time. I mean, when people can go in and completely remove the government and take over and say, there is no God in this land. And the people are like, okay. I mean, that's crazy. And coming from a Christian perspective, I don't care if you're Catholic or Protestant or whatever, coming from a Christian perspective, you're like, whoa. You just, I mean, and then for you to be the ultimate authority, where all the people are like, oh, did you hear what they said? I mean, looking at the church, I mean, you got to know they either had to sink or swim. So, I mean, you can't get all over the Catholic Church for what they do. They have responsibilities to their people. So they did what they felt was right. All right. So, while all of this stuff was going on in France and the surrounding areas, let's see. Gosh, there's so much here. I may just wait and go over this next week, because I think I'm going to end up messing you up if I'm not careful. So your chapter 37 that you're going to be reading about is going to talk about, I'm just going to mention it, and then we'll talk about it next time. It's going to talk about this concept of the low church, And the high church, and basically it's so funny. So we talked about the new and the old church that's, back in the colonies, and, one is very staunch traditional, and why are you freaking out about this? And the other one is like, we need revival, we don't care about tradition, right? It's basically the same thing. It's almost like the Anglican or the Catholic churches on one side, very traditional, and then you've got the Protestant on the other side, and it's very revival-oriented. Both have mixtures of each, but they emphasize their own, whatever their agenda is. This is the same thing. The low church was much more like a Protestant mindset, where, that's a loose term, where they're like, you've got to be born again. You've got to have a relationship with Christ. It's got to be individual. You've got to do all. You've got to read the Word. All this stuff. It's very individual, revival oriented. Got to be born again. This church is the seedbed. This is what evangelicalism came out of. So this is the seedbed for evangelicals. Okay, the high church is basically the other side. It's basically the Church of England, based in it anyway, where they're like, okay, the traditions of the church have to be maintained. And so it's not that there is no concept of being born again. I am not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that the traditions of the church, this side of it is much more interested in telling you this is how you do it. You do it just like this. Whereas this side is saying, I don't care how you do it, but have a revival. Make Jesus the center of your life. Get born again and see where it takes you. This one says, oh, no. This is how you do it, and this is where it's going to take you. So this is very orderly and very tradition-based, and this is a little bit more, I guess, free-spirited, for lack of a better word. But we'll talk. You'll read about it and learn about all these guys and these councils and all this stuff that come out of the low church and the high church. But you'll notice that it's kind of a pattern. Like anytime you get into any sort of movement, just like with the Methodists we talked about earlier, they started off with the same ideal, but they split into Calvinism and Arminianism. Well, they're still Methodists, whatever. And then the new church and the old church, where's the tradition? Well, where's your revival? Same thing here. This is, where is your tradition? You need to keep the traditions of the church. And again, coming off of the French Revolution, coming off of Vatican I, all these, it's no wonder that these people are looking and saying, oh, you're playing a dangerous, dangerous game. You need to stick to what you know, what's been working for thousands of years, and quit being crazy, because crazy people start revolutions. Right? And then you've got the low church saying, we're not one to shut down the government. We just want you to have a revival experience, and then you can share it with somebody else, and they can have a revival experience, right? And yeah, if the traditions flow into that, sweet. But all we care about is revival. Let's meet Jesus. That kind of thing. So it's kind of like the same side of, or the different side of the same coin kind of thing. Anyway, that's it. So that is the French Revolution, and at least immediately within the first 100 years or 50 years or whatever or so, how it impacted not just France, but all around. It was a big deal. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. But it's so much fun. Like I think it's so fun to learn about all this stuff. All right. So your homework are these 36 through 38. I think that we only have 4 more lectures.